The rain had teeth that night. It came down slanted and mean across the mountain road west of Denver, the kind of cold November downpour that turned asphalt into black glass and made headlights useless beyond 20 feet. The first helicopter broke through the cloud ceiling at 9:05 p.m., its rotors shredding the storm into horizontal sheets that stung like thrown gravel. The second followed 9 seconds later, banking hard over the tree line, its belly lights flooding the two-lane road in a wash of clinical white that made the rain look like static on a dead television screen. They landed in the middle of Interstate 70 auxiliary route where the shoulder widened near mile marker 214. Rotor wash flattened the scrub brush and sent loose gravel skittering into the drainage ditch. A state trooper's cruiser sat diagonal across both lanes, light bars cycling red and blue into the storm, and behind it the crumpled remains of a black Suburban rested against the guardrail, its front end folded into a shape that no longer resembled engineering. The medic from the first helicopter hit the ground running before the skids fully settled. He carried a trauma bag over one shoulder and a portable monitor under his arm, and the wind nearly took him sideways before he steadied against the fuselage and sprinted toward the stretcher that two paramedics were fighting to keep level in the downpour. On that stretcher lay a 9-year-old girl, and she was dying. Her name was Lily Drake, and she was the only daughter of Governor Harlan Drake of the state of Colorado, and none of that mattered to the swelling that was slowly, methodically closing her throat from the inside. The car accident had done its visible damage, lacerations along her left arm, a deep bruise spreading across her collarbone, but the real catastrophe was hidden beneath the skin of her neck, where blunt force trauma to the larynx had triggered edema that was swelling her airway shut like a fist tightening around a straw. The medic reached the stretcher, and his voice cracked through the chaos, high and sharp and barely controlled. The report said a doctor was en route. "Where's the doctor? Somebody find the doctor right now." But the on-call trauma physician at St. Elden Medical Center was pinned behind a 12-car pileup on the downtown connector, and the backup was 40 minutes out from Colorado Springs, and 40 minutes was a number that belonged to a different universe than the one this girl was living in. Her chest barely lifted. Her lips had begun shading from pink to a color that paramedics learned to recognize before they learned to fear, and then they fear it for the rest of their careers. A strangled, wet sound escaped her throat. Not a breath, not a cry. Something caught between the two, and the lead paramedic's hands trembled as he tried to reposition her head. Then from the edge of the road beyond the trooper's cruiser and the ring of emergency lights, a figure stepped out of the darkness. He moved without hurry. He carried a cardboard box under one arm and wore the dark gray uniform of a cleaning company soaked through and clinging to his frame, and his face held the kind of stillness that did not belong to bystanders. He walked toward the chaos with the unhurried certainty of a man who had entered rooms like this before, rooms where the air tasted like adrenaline and the clock was made of blood, and he had entered them so many times that urgency had long ago been replaced by something quieter and more dangerous precision. He had been fired 47 minutes earlier. 50 minutes before the helicopters split the sky open, Marcus Cole was mopping a hallway on the second floor of St. Elden Medical Center. The administrative wing east corridor, the stretch between human resources and the records archive that nobody visited after 6 o'clock. He worked the mop in long, efficient strokes, the kind that came from repetition rather than enthusiasm, guiding soapy water across linoleum that reflected the fluorescent lights in pale, trembling lines. His phone buzzed in his back pocket. He leaned the mop against the wall and pulled it out. The screen showed a photo of a 13-year-old boy with dark hair and a crooked grin, and below the photo, the name Owen glowed in white letters. Marcus answered before the second ring. The boy's voice came through with the particular urgency of a 7th grader who had been staring at the same geometry problem for 30 minutes and had reached the point where the textbook felt like a personal insult. "Dad, this triangle thing makes no sense. It says find the hypotenuse, but they only give me one side and an angle. And Mr. Harmon said we need to show all our work, and I don't even know where to start." Marcus leaned against the wall, a faint smile pulling at the corner of his mouth, despite the ache that had settled behind his ribs earlier that evening. He spoke quietly, patiently, walking Owen through the relationship between the sine of an angle and the ratio of the opposite side to the hypotenuse, breaking it into pieces small enough that a frustrated 13-year-old could reassemble them into understanding. He could hear Owen's pencil scratching paper on the other end, the small grunts of concentration, the sudden intake of breath when the logic clicked. Wait, wait, so I multiply the side by the sine of the angle, and that gives me the opposite side, and then I can use Pythagorean to get the hypotenuse. Marcus's chest warmed. You've got it, buddy. Show your work clean. Mr. Harmon likes neat margins. Owen laughed the bright, unguarded laugh of a kid who had conquered something that seemed impossible 5 minutes ago. Thanks, Dad. You coming home soon? Couple more hours. There's leftover pasta in the fridge. Don't stay up past 10. He ended the call and stood for a moment in the empty corridor, holding the phone against his thigh, looking at nothing. The hallway hummed with silence. Somewhere below, the emergency department murmured with its constant, low-grade urgency, lives being triaged and treated, and occasionally lost, and Marcus could hear it the way a retired sailor hears the ocean from a house on a cliff, distant, familiar, and aching with everything it used to mean. He picked up the mop. He had 3 more hallways and a restroom to finish before his shift ended at 9. He never finished them. At 8:22 p.m., Ray Taggart appeared at the end of the corridor. Taggart was the night shift manager for Pinnacle Cleaning Services, the contract company that handled janitorial work for St. Elden's non-clinical areas. He was a thick man with a clipboard perpetually tucked under his arm and a disposition that suggested he had been disappointed by life early and had spent the subsequent decades confirming that disappointment at every opportunity. He gestured Marcus toward a small supply closet that doubled as a break room, and his expression carried the particular satisfaction of someone about to deliver bad news they had rehearsed. Inside, Taggart laid it out. The fire alarm system in Wing B had triggered 3 false alerts in the past week. Maintenance had traced the fault to a junction box in the ceiling of Corridor B7, a corridor Marcus had been assigned to clean 4 nights ago. The junction box housing had been found improperly seated, and Taggart was attributing the displacement to Marcus's floor buffer, which he alleged had bumped the ceiling-mounted unit during routine cleaning. Marcus knew this was wrong. He knew the junction box had been flagged for replacement in a maintenance report 6 months earlier, a report that Taggart himself had signed off on and then buried because ordering replacement parts required paperwork that Taggart found inconvenient. Marcus knew this because he had read the maintenance log, not out of curiosity, but out of the habit of a man whose former life had taught him that systems fail when people stop paying attention to them. He could have said all of this. He could have pulled the maintenance record, pointed to Taggart's signature, and dismantled the accusation in 30 seconds. He had the evidence. He had the clarity. What he did not have was the luxury of a fight, because a fight meant a formal dispute. A formal dispute meant a review. A review meant Pinnacle would pull his personnel file and cross-reference it with whatever background check they'd originally run, and Marcus had been very careful, 7 years careful about what that background check could find. His medical license was inactive but not surrendered. His military service record was accessible to anyone with the right database query. His name, if someone typed it into the wrong search engine with the right keywords, would surface next to words like trauma surgeon and combat deployment and distinguished service. And then the quiet life he had built around Owen, the lunches he packed, the homework he helped with, the ordinary invisible existence that kept his son safe, and his past buried, all of it would unravel like a suture pulled from the wrong end. So Marcus stood in the supply closet and accepted the termination. He signed the paper. Taggart slid across the folding table. He did not argue, did not explain, did not defend. He had learned years ago that some battles cost more to win than to lose, and this was one of them. Taggart seemed almost disappointed by the lack of resistance. He delivered the final procedural details. I return your badge, collect your belongings, exit through the loading dock with the clipped efficiency of a man who had expected a fight and received instead a silence that made him vaguely uncomfortable. Marcus nodded once, took the termination letter, and left the closet. His locker was in the basement, a narrow metal compartment that held exactly what it should have held for a man who kept his life small: a rain jacket, a thermos, a spare pair of work gloves. A photograph of Owen at 6 years old taped inside the door, grinning in a way that showed the gap where his front teeth used to be. A sticker-covered lunchbox that Owen had decorated with dinosaurs and rocket ships during a weekend art project 3 years ago, and Marcus had carried it to work every day since because throwing it away felt like throwing away a piece of something he could not afford to lose. And one more thing, a medical textbook, thick and heavy, its spine cracked from use, its cover worn to a soft gray from years of being opened and closed by hands that once wielded scalpels, with the confidence of a man who understood that the distance between life and death was often measured in millimeters. Marcus had told anyone who asked that he used it as a doorstop. No one had ever asked. No one cared what a janitor kept in his locker. He picked it up, and the book fell open to the first page where a woman's handwriting slanted across the inside cover in blue ink that had faded but not disappeared. The words read, "For the man I love most, never stop saving people." Marcus closed the book. He placed it in the cardboard box along with Owen's lunchbox and the photograph and the thermos, and he walked through the basement corridor toward the loading dock. He passed the mechanical room where the hospital's ventilation system hummed its constant low note, and he passed the supplies storage where cleaning carts stood in a row like soldiers at rest, and he climbed the short ramp to the dock door and pushed it open into the rain. On his left wrist beneath the cuff of his soaked uniform, a military-issue watch ticked silently through the seconds. Except it didn't. The second hand had been frozen at the 4:17 mark for 7 years, stuck on the exact minute that the cardiac monitor in operating room 3 had flatlined, and the woman he loved had stopped being alive. He had never replaced the battery. He had never taken it to be fixed. He wore it the way some men wear wedding rings after their wives are gone, not as a reminder of what was, but as proof that time for him had stopped meaning what it meant for everyone else. He stepped into the rain and began walking. The road from St. Elden's loading dock connected to a service path that ran parallel to the I-70 auxiliary route, winding through a stretch of foothills west of Denver, where the suburbs thinned into scrubland and the streetlights gave up trying. Marcus lived 4 miles from the hospital in a rented 2-bedroom house at the edge of a town that barely qualified for a zip code. He walked because the last bus had left at 7:30, and because a taxi cost $18, he could not justify spending, not when rent was due in 6 days, and the checking account held enough to cover it only if nothing else went wrong. Something had gone wrong, something always did. The rain came harder. He shifted the cardboard box to his opposite hip and lowered his head against the wind, and his boots found the gravel shoulder by feel more than sight. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights sweeping across him and then abandoning him to the dark, and in those brief flashes of illumination, he was just a man on the side of the road carrying a box indistinguishable from any other figure the world had decided not to notice. His mind did what it always did when his body was occupied with something mechanical and his defenses were low. It went back. The tent materialized first. Canvas walls snapping in desert wind, the air thick with dust and the copper smell of blood, a portable surgical light buzzing overhead with the inconsistency of a generator running on fumes. He was 34 years old and Major Marcus Cole, MD, FACS, and the soldier on the table in front of him was 22 and had a piece of shrapnel the size of a thumbnail lodged a centimeter from his carotid artery, and the kid's airway was collapsing because the blast had turned his tracheal cartilage into something that no longer held its shape. Marcus could feel the memory in his hands. The number 20 scalpel, its weight precise and familiar against his index finger and thumb. The palpation of the cricothyroid membrane, that small, soft depression between the thyroid and cricoid cartilage that his fingertips could locate in the dark in a sandstorm in the back of a moving vehicle, because he had practiced the motion so many times it had migrated from skill to instinct. The horizontal incision controlled no more than 1.5 centimeters, the 6.0 mm tracheostomy tube threaded through the opening, while his left hand stabilized the trachea, and his right guided the tube with the steadiness that adrenaline paradoxically sharpened rather than shook. The improvised suction, a 20 cubic centimeter syringe connected to IV tubing, because the portable suction unit had died 2 patients earlier, and there was nothing to replace it with except ingenuity and the refusal to let a 22-year-old die on a table in a tent in the middle of nowhere. The soldier had lived. Marcus had cleaned the blood from his hands, walked outside the tent into heat that pressed against his face like an open oven door, and performed the same procedure on another soldier 40 minutes later. And then a third. It was that kind of day. There were a lot of those kinds of days. He blinked and the desert dissolved. He was back on the Colorado road, rain streaming down his face, and his hands were gripping a cardboard box instead of a scalpel. And the only thing collapsing was the distance between who he had been and who he had chosen to become. The second memory came uninvited, the way it always did, sliding in through the gap, the first one left open. Sarah. Her face arrived before the context did, the way faces do, when the person attached to them defined everything. Dark eyes, sharp jaw, a smile that carried both warmth and challenge. The smile of a woman who had matched him in every arena that mattered: medical school residency, military service, parenthood, and who had done it with a grace that made his own competence feel like something rougher and less refined. She had been an emergency physician. She had served 2 deployments in the same theater, different forward base, and they had met during a joint operations briefing where she had corrected a colonel's misquote of triage protocol with such polite precision that the colonel had thanked her before realizing he'd been publicly corrected. Marcus had known within 10 minutes that he was going to love this woman, and he had been right, and the rightness of it had sustained him through every impossible day that followed. Then the memory shifted the way it always shifted, from the version of Sarah who was alive to the version who was not. St. Elden Medical Center 7 years ago. Delivery room complications, a phrase that contained an entire catastrophe in 3 words. Amniotic fluid embolism, a condition so rare and so sudden that it turned a routine delivery into a code blue in the time it took to draw a breath. Sarah's blood pressure had cratered. Her lungs had filled. Her heart had stuttered, then stopped, then stuttered again before stopping for good. Marcus had been in the waiting room. He had been in the waiting room because he was the father, not the doctor. And the rules said fathers wait and doctors work, and by the time someone realized that this father was also a surgeon who had held dying soldiers steady with his bare hands, it was already over. He had stood outside operating room 3 and listened to the monitor produce the sound that would redefine every sound he heard for the rest of his life. A single sustained, unwavering tone that meant the woman behind the door was no longer the woman he had married. Owen had survived, 6 pounds, 4 ounces, healthy, perfect. And Marcus had held his son in the recovery room and made 2 decisions simultaneously: he would keep this boy alive and safe at any cost, and he would never hold a scalpel again, because the instrument that had saved hundreds of strangers had not saved the only person who mattered. He had walked away from medicine that week, surrendered his hospital privileges, let his license lapse into inactive status, moved to a rented house near the mountains, and found the only job that would let him work nights while Owen slept, the only job that put him inside a hospital without requiring him to be a doctor, the only job that let him walk the same halls where Sarah had died, because punishment and proximity were the 2 things he understood better than healing. 7 years. 2,555 nights of mopping floors in a building that held his wife's death in its walls like a stain that no amount of cleaning could reach. And now they had fired him from that too. The rain slackened for a moment, then doubled its effort, and Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and kept walking. The road curved ahead, climbing slightly toward a stretch where the auxiliary route ran parallel to the main highway, separated by a concrete median and 100 yards of scrub. His house was still 2 miles out. His feet hurt. The cardboard box was going soft in the rain, and he adjusted his grip to keep it from collapsing. He was thinking about the pasta in the fridge. He was thinking about whether Owen had actually gone to bed by 10 or was still up reading those graphic novels he hid under his pillow. He was thinking about how to explain the termination in a way that a 13-year-old would accept without asking the kind of follow-up questions that 13-year-olds were terrifyingly good at asking. He was constructing the fiction of tomorrow morning. Dad got transferred to a different building. Dad's schedule is changing. Everything's fine when the sky above him split open with light. The sound arrived a half-second later, a deep mechanical thunder that shook the raindrops sideways and pressed against his chest like a physical force. Marcus stopped walking. He looked up and saw the belly of a helicopter no more than 80 feet above him, its landing lights turning the rain into a curtain of white fire, its rotors beating the air into submission as it descended toward the road ahead. Then a second one appeared behind it, banking hard from the northeast, and the 2 aircraft settled onto the asphalt with the controlled violence of machines designed to deliver people to emergencies that polite society preferred not to think about. Marcus stood at the edge of the road 50 meters from the landing zone, rain sliding off his shoulders, and watched the crisis assemble itself with the speed and disorder that crises always carry. Paramedics pulled a stretcher from the back of the crumpled Suburban. State troopers waved traffic to a halt. Voices competed with the rotor noise, urgent, fragmented, not yet organized into the kind of communication that saves lives. And on the stretcher beneath a thermal blanket soaked dark with rain, a small figure convulsed and fought for air that her body was no longer able to receive. He saw it immediately. The angle of the girl's head tilted back too far, compensating for a passage that was narrowing by the second. The retraction of the muscles along her neck, pulling inward with each attempt to inhale the tissue around her trachea, working desperately to open a channel, that swelling was closing like a door shutting in slow motion. The sound, a high-pitched, wet stridor that cut through the rotor noise and the shouting and the rain, a sound Marcus had heard in tents and field hospitals and the backs of armored vehicles, a sound that meant the clock had started and the clock was short. His hands adjusted their grip on the cardboard box. His breathing changed. Not faster, slower, deeper, the controlled respiration of a body that recognized threat and responded not with panic, but with a practiced narrowing of attention that filtered out everything that did not matter and left only the essential patient airway time. From the second helicopter, a woman descended. She moved with purpose, a medical bag over her shoulder, her flight suit already darkened with rain. Doctor. Nadia Lawson was 38 years old, a board-certified emergency physician who had spent the last 3 years flying critical care transport across Colorado's mountain corridors. And before that, she had spent 4 years deployed to combat zones where the difference between a good doctor and a dead patient was measured in the steadiness of your hands and the speed of your decisions. She hit the ground and assessed the scene in the 3 seconds it took her to cross the distance between the helicopter and the stretcher. 2 paramedics overwhelmed. One medic from the first helicopter, fumbling with an airway kit that looked like it had been packed by someone in a hurry. A state trooper trying to keep a perimeter. And a man in a dark suit who was pushing past everyone to reach the stretcher, his face a mask of terror that authority could not conceal. Governor Harlan Drake had been in the Suburban when the pickup truck ran the red light. His security detail had taken the brunt of the front-end impact. His driver had a broken wrist. The governor himself had walked away with bruises. His daughter had not walked away at all. Nadia reached the stretcher, and her hands went to the girl's neck, palpating for landmarks, assessing the swelling, calculating how much time remained before the edema completed its work and sealed the airway entirely. Her answer was not encouraging. She looked at the airway kit the medic had opened and saw immediately that the laryngoscope blade was the wrong size, the endotracheal tubes were for adults, and the portable suction unit had a cracked seal that rendered it useless. The backup equipment was in the second helicopter, but the bag had been jostled during landing, and the intubation set was scattered across the cabin floor. She did not panic. She organized. Her voice carried across the rain with the kind of clarity that comes from years of giving orders in places where hesitation killed people. She directed the paramedics to elevate the stretcher's head. She instructed the medic to find pediatric-sized equipment from the ambulance parked beyond the trooper's cruiser. She physically guided the governor away from the stretcher with a firm hand on his shoulder and words that were respectful in form and absolute in substance. Sir, I need you to step back. I need room to work. But she knew her limits. Nadia Lawson could intubate a patient in a moving helicopter at 12,000 feet. She could manage a cardiac arrest in the back of a pickup truck on a dirt road in the Rockies. What she had never done not once in her career was perform a surgical cricothyrotomy on a pediatric patient in the field. It was a procedure that required specific training, specific experience, and the specific steadiness that came from having done it under pressure multiple times. She had done it in simulation. She had assisted in the operating room. She had never done it alone in the rain on a child with no margin for error, and she could hear the girl's airway closing. Every breath was thinner than the last. Every second compressed the window between intervention and irreversibility. She needed a surgeon, and the surgeon was stuck behind 12 wrecked cars in downtown Denver, and the backup was 35 minutes away, and 35 minutes was a death sentence dressed in a reasonable number. Marcus set the cardboard box on the wet gravel at the edge of the road. He did it without deciding to the way a man puts down a weight when his hands are needed for something more important. He stepped forward toward the barrier of yellow tape the trooper had strung between traffic cones, and his posture shifted in a way that he was not fully conscious of. Shoulders back, chin, level, weight balanced the bearing of a man who had walked into operating theaters and combat zones with the same unhurried gait, because both environments demanded the same thing, calm that was not performed but manufactured in the deepest architecture of the nervous system. A security agent stepped into his path. One of the governor's detail suit, dark with rain, earpiece wire trailing down his neck. The agent's hand came up palm out, and his expression conveyed the particular irritation of a man whose job was to keep unauthorized people away from important people and who had no patience for civilians who did not understand the boundary. Marcus did not argue. He leaned slightly, looking past the agent's shoulder toward the stretcher, and what he saw confirmed what he had heard. The girl's chest was barely lifting. The stridor had changed pitch higher, tighter, the sound of an airway approaching, total occlusion. Her skin under the emergency lights had taken on the blue-gray pallor of cyanosis, the oxygen in her blood dropping below the threshold where cells began to starve. He stepped forward again. The agent's hand moved to his chest, ready to push him back. Marcus did not retreat. His voice came out low and specific, carrying the cadence of a man accustomed to delivering information that people needed to act on immediately. She has less than 30 seconds before full obstruction. Tilt her head, the airway is collapsing inward. If you wait for the doctor who isn't coming, she dies. The agent blinked. The precision of the language, the clinical terminology delivered without hesitation, created a dissonance against the janitor's uniform that the agent's training could not immediately resolve. His hand remained on Marcus's chest, but the push did not come. Governor Drake spun toward them. Rain streaked across his face, and fear had hollowed his eyes into something raw and animal. His voice broke across the noise. "Who are you? Why are you touching the barrier?" "Back away from my daughter." The lead medic glanced at Marcus, and in that glance was the silent, desperate question of a professional who knew he was outmatched and was searching for anyone who might not be. Marcus met the medic's eyes, and then the governor's, and the weight behind his gaze was not defiance, but the accumulated gravity of every life he had held in his hands, in places the governor had never been and could never imagine. "Sir, your daughter will not survive to reach the hospital. You can argue with me, or you can let me save her." The governor's mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked at the stretcher, at his daughter's chest, straining for air that could not arrive at the medic's trembling hands, and something broke inside the calculation. He was running the risk of trusting a stranger versus the certainty of watching his child suffocate, and the result was a silence that Marcus took as permission. He moved past the agent in a single fluid motion, not pushing, not shoving, simply occupying the space the agent's hesitation had created, and he was at the stretcher before anyone could form the words to stop him. Nadia looked up from the girl's neck. She saw a drenched civilian in a cleaning company uniform, no badge, no credentials, and her first instinct was to order him away. But his hands were already moving to the girl's jaw, palpating the landmarks of the anterior neck with a touch so practiced and precise that it bypassed her skepticism and spoke directly to the part of her brain that recognized surgical competence, the way a musician recognizes another musician's hands on an instrument. Her eyes dropped to his wrist. The cuff of his uniform had ridden up, and there on the inside of his left forearm, faded, but unmistakable, was a small tattoo, a scalpel crossed with a caduceus, and below it the numbers 274 and the letters FST. She knew that symbol. She had seen it in military medical briefings. The 274th Forward Surgical Team, a unit that had been deployed to the most kinetic combat zones of the past 2 decades. A unit whose surgeons operated in conditions that civilian medicine could not replicate. A unit that had been quietly deactivated after its commanding surgeon disappeared from the medical world 7 years ago under circumstances no one would explain. Her breath caught. Her hand moved involuntarily to his wrist, gripping it for a single second, not restraint, not affection, but the instinctive recognition of one soldier reaching across the dark to confirm that another soldier was real. Marcus pulled his wrist free. Their eyes met. Hers held shock and the beginning of a question. His held nothing he was willing to share. The moment lasted less than a heartbeat, but in that fraction of time, 2 people who had lived inside the same kind of war recognized each other across the distance of everything they had both tried to forget. He spoke without looking away from the girl. "I need a scalpel, a rigid catheter, and suction. If you don't have suction, give me the smallest tubing you've got and manual pressure." Nadia snapped into motion. She rummaged through the disorganized kit, her hands moving with the frantic efficiency of someone racing against a timeline she could feel collapsing. "We're missing half the airway tools." The kit wasn't prepped for pediatric surgical intervention. Then give me what you have. The certainty in his voice steadied her the way a keel steadies a ship. She found a number 20 scalpel still sealed, a 4.0 cuff tracheostomy tube pediatric. No suction unit, but she had a 10 cubic centimeter syringe and a length of thin IV tubing that could serve as improvised aspiration if applied with enough precision and enough nerve. She placed them in his hands, and the items seemed to settle into his grip like parts of a machine returning to their design configuration. The governor pressed closer, face drained white. This is my daughter. If you touch her again without telling me who you are, I will have you. Marcus lifted his eyes from the girl's throat and met the governor's gaze, and what the governor saw there stopped his sentence, the way a wall stops a car. It was not anger. It was not arrogance. It was the quiet, absolute certainty of a man who had watched fathers lose their children in places far worse than this, who had delivered the news and absorbed the grief and carried the weight, and then walked into the next tent to try to prevent it from happening again. Night after night, deployment after deployment, until the cost of caring had burned away everything except the competence. I took the right because she didn't have time for anyone else. And because you need someone who knows what he's doing. Nadia placed her hand on the governor's arm and pulled him back with gentle force. Her voice came low and firm, a sentence that was not a request. Governor, he saved her from the barrier. Let him save her now. The governor stumbled back. The rain intensified. Marcus positioned himself beside the stretcher. His fingers moved to the girl's neck, locating the cricothyroid membrane by touch, that soft depression between the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage. The anatomical landmark he could find, blindfolded, that his muscle memory had cataloged so deeply it existed in a place beyond thought. The girl's trachea was nearly closed. The tissue around the incision site was swollen and angry, and the window for a clean entry was measured in seconds that were disappearing with each weak, wet gasp that escaped her lips. The medics formed a tense semicircle. They did not know if they were witnessing madness or mastery. The governor's security detail stood, frozen hands hovering near holsters that had no relevance to this kind of emergency. Marcus inhaled once. The noise fell away. The rain became background. The rotor wash became silence. He entered the space he had lived inside for years, the space where nothing existed except the patient, the instrument, and the distance between cutting and not cutting. He made the incision, horizontal, precise, through skin and subcutaneous tissue and the cricothyroid membrane itself, a cut no longer than 1.5 centimeters, but executed with the economy of motion that only comes from having made the same cut dozens of times in conditions that would break most surgeons before they reached for the blade. He felt the membrane give way. He felt a small rush of air that meant he had reached the tracheal lumen. The 4.0 tube went in. His left hand stabilized the trachea, while his right guided the tube through the incision, threading it into the narrowing airway with the delicacy of a man disarming something that would explode if his hand moved a millimeter in the wrong direction. The tube met resistance, swelling, pressing from all sides, and he adjusted the angle by 2 degrees, a correction so subtle that none of the medics watching could have described what he had done differently, only that the tube was suddenly through and seated, and the girl's chest lifted. Not much. A thin, shuddering breath pulled through the improvised airway with the desperation of lungs that had been starving. Then another. Then a third, slightly stronger, slightly deeper, the fragile rhythm of a body clawing its way back from the edge. Nadia pressed the stethoscope to the girl's chest and listened. Her shoulders dropped 4 inches as the tension left them. She's oxygenating. The medic beside her covered his mouth. Another whispered something profane and sacred in the same breath. The governor staggered backward, watching the impossible occur beneath rain that had not stopped and might never stop, watching his daughter's chest rise with the small, miraculous regularity of someone who was, against all probability, still alive. Marcus kept working. He attached the 10cc syringe to the IV tubing and applied manual suction to clear the fluid that had accumulated around the incision, a process that required steady pressure and a rhythmic technique that he performed without conscious effort, the way a pianist's left hand maintains a bass line while the right hand handles the melody. He monitored her pulse at the carotid, weak, erratic, but climbing. He adjusted the tube's angle to optimize airflow. He did not look at the governor. He did not look at the medics. He did not look at anything except the 9-year-old girl whose life was tethered to a tube he had placed with hands that had not held a surgical instrument in 7 years. When her breathing stabilized, not strong, not safe, but stable enough to transport, he raised his eyes for the first time. He found Nadia watching him with an expression he had seen before on the faces of people who had witnessed something they could not reconcile with what they thought they knew about the world. She's stable enough to move. Prep the helicopter. We don't have long. For the first time since the chaos erupted, everyone listened to him. The medics scrambled. The stretcher was lifted and repositioned for loading. Nadia directed the preparation with renewed confidence, tightening straps, checking the airway, matching Marcus's pace without a single question, the way two people who have trained in the same crucible can synchronize without rehearsal. The governor approached soaked and trembling. His voice had lost its authority and found something rawer underneath. Who gave you the right to do this? Marcus did not turn his head. He kept his attention on the airway placement, adjusting the tube a final fraction to improve the angle of ventilation. His answer carried no emotion except the flat, depleted honesty of a man who had spent everything he had. I took the right because she didn't have time for anyone else. Nadia stepped close enough for the governor to hear her over the storm. Governor, he saved her. Without him, she would have gone into full respiratory arrest before any of us could have intervened. The governor swallowed. He knew she was right. The knowledge sat on his face like a verdict. He looked at Marcus at the soaked janitor's uniform, the cardboard box of belongings sitting on the gravel 50 meters away, the military watch on the man's wrist with its frozen second hand, and the dissonance between what he saw and what he had just witnessed created a fracture in his understanding that would take days to fully process. Nadia leaned toward Marcus, lowering her voice to a register only he could hear. We could use you in the air. Your presence could stabilize her through transit. Marcus shook his head. A small motion, gentle funnel. She'll hold as long as you don't reposition the tube. Keep the airway supported and monitor for pulse drops during ascent. Pressure changes at altitude could shift the swelling pattern. Watch for it. It was not refusal born of pride. It was the quiet, wary withdrawal of a man who had learned what happened when he stayed too close to the work that once consumed him. He had crossed a line tonight that he had drawn 7 years ago, and every additional step deeper into this world increased the risk that the world would reach back and take from him the only thing he had left. Nadia searched his face. There was something in his eyes that did not match his clothes. Something trained, something wounded, something that carried the particular blend of discipline and damage that she recognized because she saw a version of it every morning in her own mirror. She wanted to ask. The girl needed her more. The pilot shouted from the cockpit, "We need to lift now." Nadia nodded and stepped into the helicopter. The medics followed, one securing the stretcher, the other preparing supplemental oxygen. Marcus backed away from the aircraft door. The governor stood in the rain, staring at Marcus with the expression of a man torn between needing answers and fearing what they might cost. When this is over, I want your name. Marcus did not respond. The helicopter lifted, beating the rain into wild concentric patterns across the road, its lights cutting through the storm as it rose and banked east toward Denver. He watched it ascend until the lights disappeared into the cloud ceiling and the sound of the rotors faded to a distant pulse that the storm eventually swallowed. Then he exhaled. The world reassembled around him. The state trooper was speaking into his radio. Bystanders from stopped cars whispered behind the yellow tape. The second helicopter sat quiet on the road, its crew securing equipment. Sirens wailed from somewhere south, growing closer, but no longer urgent, arriving too late to matter. The security agent who had tried to stop him approached him slowly, guilt reshaping his features into something uncertain. Sir, I didn't know. Marcus gave a slight nod. Not forgiveness, acknowledgement. He turned toward the gravel shoulder where his cardboard box sat in a puddle. He had taken 4 steps toward it when the paramedic from the ambulance, parked beyond the trooper's cruiser, jogged up behind him, slightly out of breath. Sir, hold on. The doctor on the helicopter radioed down before liftoff. She's requesting you follow to St. Elden. The patient's condition may deteriorate during transport, and the doctor wants you available. Marcus stopped. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, but the cold had deepened, and he could feel it in his fingers and his jaw and the place behind his sternum where exhaustion lived. He looked in the direction of his house, 2 miles through the dark, a warm kitchen, Owen asleep or pretending to be the quiet, ordinary sanctuary that asked nothing of him except presence. Then he looked toward the ambulance, its back doors open, interior light casting a yellow rectangle on the wet road. Beyond it, somewhere east, a helicopter carried a 9-year-old girl whose airway he had opened, with hands he had sworn would never operate again toward a hospital that had fired him 90 minutes ago, a hospital where his wife had died in a room he could still locate by the sound of his own footsteps. The paramedic waited. Marcus picked up his cardboard box, the spine of the medical textbook pressing against his ribs through the softened cardboard, and walked toward the ambulance. He climbed into the back, sat on the bench seat, and placed the box on his lap. The doors closed. The siren did not activate. There was no emergency requiring speed. Only a man being carried back to the exact place he had spent 7 years trying to survive and 47 minutes trying to leave. The engine started. The ambulance pulled onto the road heading east, and through the small rear window, Marcus watched the landing zone shrink behind him, the flares still burning on the asphalt, the rain still falling on the place where everything had changed. He looked down at the box in his lap. Owen's lunchbox with its dinosaur stickers, the photograph, the book with Sarah's handwriting, the thermos. He was going back to St. Elden. Not as a janitor, not as a doctor. As something he did not yet have a name for, a man caught between the life he had buried and the life that refused to stay underground, pulled toward a building that held both his greatest loss and now the undeniable evidence that the thing he had tried to kill inside himself was still alive, still capable, still answering when a child's breath grew thin. The ambulance turned onto the highway connector. Denver's lights appeared through the rain, distant and diffuse, and somewhere ahead of him, a helicopter was descending toward a rooftop helipad, carrying a girl who would breathe through the night because a man with a mop and a broken watch had remembered in the space of a single breath everything he had spent 7 years trying to forget. Marcus Cole closed his eyes. The ambulance carried him east. The rain did not stop. The ambulance pulled into the bay at St. Elden Medical Center at 9:47 p.m., and Marcus felt the building before he saw it. The fluorescent glow through the rear windows carried a particular frequency that his nervous system had cataloged years ago, and the smell hit when the doors opened. Antiseptic layered over industrial cleaner layered over the faint metallic trace of recycled air, pushed through ducts that had been breathing the same molecules since the building's last renovation in 2014. He had mopped those ducts' floor vents 6 hours ago. He had cleaned the baseboards of this bay 2 nights before. His body knew this place the way a prisoner knows his cell, every surface memorized, through the accumulation of routine contact that eventually becomes indistinguishable from intimacy. He stepped out with the cardboard box under his arm, and the cold hit him again, sharper now in the gap between the ambulance's warmth and the bay's concrete chill. The helicopter had already landed on the rooftop pad 4 minutes ahead. He could hear its rotors winding down through the building's structure, a vibration more felt than heard transmitted through steel beams and concrete floors to the soles of his boots. Inside the trauma wing's corridor had the particular electricity of a facility spinning up for an emergency it had not prepared for. Nurses moved with purpose, but without direction, carrying equipment they had not been told where to deliver. A radiology tech pushed a portable X-ray unit toward the trauma bay and nearly collided with an orderly hauling an oxygen cylinder in the opposite direction. The organized chaos of a well-run hospital had been replaced by the disorganized urgency of a system caught flat-footed, and Marcus recognized the pattern because he had seen it before in field hospitals, where the first casualties arrived before the surgical team had finished at setting up the gap between the crisis and the readiness, the space where mistakes lived. He moved toward the trauma bay by instinct, following the route that emergency patients traveled, from the rooftop elevator to the double doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only," and he was 12 steps from those doors when a voice stopped him. Hey, wait." The night shift nurse behind the triage desk had risen from her chair. She was mid-40s, efficient-looking, and her eyes carried the sharpness of someone who had worked the same ward for enough years to recognize every face that routinely passed through it. She recognized his, not as a doctor, not as a visitor, as the man who emptied the trash bins outside her station every Tuesday and Thursday night and occasionally left the floor smelling faintly of pine cleaner that she had once complimented because it was better than the industrial bleach the previous janitor had used. "You're the custodial guy," From Pinnacle. You can't be back here. This wing is restricted during a trauma activation. Marcus halted. The absurdity of the moment pressed against him like a physical weight. 93 minutes ago, he had been terminated from this building for a faulty junction box. 46 minutes ago, he had performed a surgical airway on the governor's daughter with equipment scrounged from a rain-soaked emergency kit. Now he stood in a corridor he had mopped 1,000 times and was being told he did not belong here. And the worst part was that she was right. He did not belong here. He had made sure of that for 7 years. The nurse reached for the desk phone. "Security, please." "We have an unauthorized individual in the trauma corridor." The elevator at the end of the hall opened. Governor Harlan Drake stepped out, flanked by 2 agents who had the rain-darkened look of men who had been standing outside in bad weather, and the rigid bearing of men who were prepared to stand in worse. The governor's suit was destroyed, jacket torn at the shoulder, shirt untucked, tie missing entirely, but his face carried the ferocity of a man operating on fear, converted into authority. He scanned the corridor, found Marcus, and pointed. "Let him through. Now." The nurse's hand froze on the phone. The governor's voice left no space for protocol. His agents moved ahead, clearing the path with the wordless efficiency of men accustomed to making hallways open, and Marcus fell into step behind them, with the disorienting awareness that he was being escorted through the same building that had escorted him out less than 2 hours ago. They passed the supply closet where Taggart had fired him. The door was closed. The mop he had leaned against the wall was gone, collected by whoever had been assigned to finish his shift. The absence of it struck him harder than it should have. Not the mop itself, but the evidence that he had already been erased from the building's routine, replaced before his footprints in the loading dock had dried. The trauma bay doors parted. Inside, the temperature dropped 3 degrees, and the light shifted to the blue-white of surgical overheads, and Marcus stepped into the room where Lily Drake lay on a gurney, surrounded by a team that was working hard and falling behind. Dr. Brandt stood at the head of the gurney. He was 51, silver-templed, and built with the compact precision of a man who ran marathons and approached surgery with the same disciplined endurance. His hands held a laryngoscope and a size 5.0 endotracheal tube, and he was attempting to intubate the girl through her mouth, and he was failing. The swelling that Marcus had bypassed on the roadside had continued its progression during the helicopter transit, and the tissue around Lily's larynx had ballooned to the point where the vocal cords were no longer visible through the scope. Brandt repositioned, tried again. The tube met a wall of inflamed tissue and stopped. The monitors told the story in numbers. Oxygen saturation at 89% and dropping. Heart rate at 142, the rapid flutter of a small body burning through its reserves. Blood pressure unstable, oscillating between values that belonged to different patients. The cardiovascular system struggling to compensate for an oxygen debt that was compounding by the second. Marcus stood just inside the doors. Nadia was already at the bedside, assisting Brandt, suctioning the airway, adjusting the girl's head position. She had changed from her flight suit into hospital scrubs at some point during the helicopter transit, and the transformation made her look like she belonged here in a way that Marcus, in his soaked custodial uniform, decidedly did not. She glanced up when he entered. Their eyes connected across the controlled pandemonium of the room, and in her gaze he read the message she could not speak aloud in front of the team. The situation was deteriorating faster than she had anticipated, and she was not certain Brandt could manage what was coming. Marcus did not move toward the gurney. Not yet. He watched. He had learned in theaters of war, where ego killed as efficiently as bullets, that entering a room and immediately overriding the commanding surgeon was a tactic that cost more time than it saved. The team would resist. Brandt would defend his territory. Precious seconds would evaporate in the friction of authority, and the girl did not have seconds to spare for the politics of professional pride. So he watched, and in watching, he saw what no one else had found. It was the bruise behind Lily's left ear. Small, purple-black, shaped like a crescent moon, partially hidden by her hair, and the cervical collar the paramedics had applied at the accident scene. Battle sign. The telltale subcutaneous hemorrhage that indicated a fracture of the petrous portion of the temporal bone, a basilar skull fracture, the kind of injury that hid beneath the surface and announced itself only through subtle signs that required specific knowledge to interpret. His gaze moved to her nose. A thin line of clear fluid traced from her left nostril down her upper lip, mixing with the condensation from the oxygen mask. To anyone not looking for it, it was mucus. To Marcus, it was cerebrospinal fluid, CSF rhinorrhea, the leakage of the fluid that cushioned the brain escaping through a fracture in the base of the skull and draining into the nasopharynx, which meant the edema closing Lily's airway was not solely traumatic laryngeal swelling from the car accident. It was compounded by CSF drainage into the pharyngeal space, creating a dual obstruction that standard intubation could not resolve, and that nasotracheal intubation, the approach Brant was now considering as his oral attempts failed, would not only fail to fix, but could catastrophically worsen by threading a tube through the fractured skull base and into the cranial cavity. The realization crystallized in the time it took Brant to reach for a nasal trumpet and position it at the girl's right nostril. Stop. The room stiffened. Brant's hand halted a centimeter from insertion. He looked up, and his expression traveled through surprise, confusion, and anger in the span of 2 seconds before settling on the cold indignation of a surgeon being interrupted in his own department. Marcus crossed the room in 4 steps. His voice carried the specific authority of information delivered without ego, the flat precision of someone reporting coordinates under fire. The edema isn't purely laryngeal. She has a basilar skull fracture, battle sign behind the left ear, CSF rhinorrhea from the left nostril. If you place that tube nasally, you risk intracranial penetration. You'll kill her. Brant's face went rigid. The nasal trumpet remained poised at the nostril, and his hesitation lasted exactly long enough for Nadia to reach across and gently redirect his hand away from the girl's face. She had already looked. She had already seen the bruise, the fluid, the confirmation of Marcus's assessment, written in the evidence that the team's urgency had caused them to overlook. He's right. I can see the CSF drainage. This is a dual mechanism obstruction. Brant lowered the instrument. His jaw worked, the muscles tightening with the effort of a man processing the fact that he had been seconds from a fatal error. His eyes moved to Marcus, and the question that formed was loaded with equal parts professional curiosity and territorial resentment. Who are you, and how did you see that from across the room? Marcus did not answer the question. There was no version of the answer that would not consume time the girl could not afford. He spoke instead to the clinical reality. She needs decompression of the pharyngeal edema before you attempt oral reintubation. Dexamethasone 10 milligrams IV, pushed to slow the inflammatory cascade. Controlled suctioning of the CSF accumulation in the pharynx. Gentle minimal negative pressure, you're working near a skull fracture. Then reposition for oral intubation with a smaller tube half a size down from what you're holding and use a bougie to navigate the swelling. Brant stared at him. The instructions were specific, sequenced, and correct in a way that did not come from textbooks but from repetition, from having managed this exact progression in conditions where the nearest imaging suite was 300 miles away, and the only diagnostic tools were fingertips and experience, and the willingness to trust what the body was telling you when the machines could not. The governor had followed them into the room. He stood near the wall, his agents flanking him, and his presence filled the silence that followed Marcus's instructions with a pressure that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with power. His daughter lay on that gurney. The man in the janitor's uniform had just prevented the chief of trauma surgery from making a lethal mistake. The arithmetic was simple, and the governor had not become governor by failing to calculate. He stepped forward. His voice carried the raw, undisguised fear of a father watching his child balanced on an edge. Do what he says. Brant's resistance collapsed. Not gracefully, his shoulders tightened and his jaw flexed, but it collapsed because the alternative was defending his approach against a man who had just identified a fracture pattern from 12 feet away and a governor whose child's life was the stakes. He nodded once sharply and turned to the team. The room reorganized around Marcus's instructions. A nurse drew dexamethasone and administered the push. Nadia took position opposite Marcus at the gurney, anticipating his movements, the way she had on the roadside, not because they had practiced together, but because they had both been trained in environments where reading your partner's intentions through body language was not a skill, but a survival requirement. She suctioned the pharynx with controlled, delicate passes, while Marcus monitored the girl's pulse and oxygen levels through his fingertips on her carotid and his eyes on the monitor. The dexamethasone needed time to work. 4 minutes for initial effect, 12 for meaningful reduction of the edema. They had perhaps 3 minutes before the existing airway Marcus had created on the roadside began to lose its efficacy as the swelling progressed around the tube. The window was closing inside a window that was already closing, and Marcus managed both timelines simultaneously with the partitioned attention of a man who had once monitored 4 critical patients in adjacent cots during a mass casualty event because there were not enough surgeons and the ones who remained had to function as multiples of themselves. At the 2-minute mark, the swelling responded, marginally but enough. The tissue around the pharynx softened a fraction of a degree, creating the space that Brandt needed. Marcus guided the reintubation verbally angle depth resistance checkpoints, while Nadia provided direct visualization with the laryngoscope, angling the blade to give Brandt a view of the vocal cords that the swelling had previously obscured. The tube went in. Brandt's hands were steadier now, guided by the specificity of Marcus's instruction, and the tube seated with a soft click of the cuff inflating against tracheal walls that finally had enough room to accept it. The monitor's oxygen reading climbed. 91, 93, 95. The heart rate began its descent from the panicked heights of oxygen deprivation toward the calmer rhythm of a body being resupplied with what it needed most. Lily's chest rose smoothly, the first truly stable breath she had taken since a pickup truck ran a red light and turned a Tuesday evening into a catastrophe. The room exhaled. A nurse pressed her hand to her mouth. An orderly who had been standing, frozen by the supply cart, sat down on the stool behind him, as though his legs had simply decided they were finished, supporting the weight of what they had witnessed. Brandt removed the laryngoscope and stood motionless for a moment, staring at the monitor, processing the proximity of the disaster he had nearly caused. He turned to Marcus. His voice was stripped of pretense. That diagnosis saved her life. If I had placed that nasal airway, she would have... He did not finish. He did not need to. The trajectory was clear to everyone in the room. A tube threaded through a basilar skull fracture would have entered the cranial vault, and the resulting damage would have made everything else irrelevant. Marcus stepped back from the gurney. The team moved in to secure the tube adjust settings, prepare for transport to the pediatric ICU. He had no further role here. The crisis had shifted from emergency to management, from the realm where his specific skills were irreplaceable to the realm where institutional medicine could handle the remainder. He drifted toward this wall, then toward the door, the gravitational pull of anonymity reasserting itself now that the immediate danger had passed. Nadia caught his arm as he turned. Her grip was brief but deliberate. You didn't lose your skill. You just lost the reason to use it. The words landed in a place he had not left unguarded, a place beneath the armor of 7 years of deliberate withdrawal, and the impact of them showed in the involuntary tightening of his jaw before he pulled free and moved through the doors into the corridor. Behind him, the governor knelt beside his daughter's gurney and pressed his forehead against her hand, and the sound that escaped him was not a word but something older and less articulable, the sound of a father's terror releasing its grip by a single insufficient degree. The corridor outside the trauma bay was 20 degrees warmer than the room he had left and 100 degrees quieter. Marcus leaned against the wall and let his head tilt back against the painted concrete. His hands were shaking, not during, never during, but always after the adrenaline's bill arriving, once the work was finished, and demanding payment and tremors and nausea, and the particular exhaustion that came from operating at a level of focus that the human nervous system was not designed to sustain. He looked at his hands, the same hands. 7 years older, rougher from mop handles and floor buffer grips and the abrasive cleaning chemicals that had slowly replaced the surgical soap he used to scrub with. But the same hands, and they had done the same work, and the muscle memory had not degraded, and the knowledge had not faded, and the instinct had not dulled, and the realization of that was not comforting. It was terrifying, because it meant the thing he had tried to bury was not dead. It was dormant, and tonight it had woken, and he did not know how to put it back to sleep. Nadia found him 6 minutes later. She had changed nothing about her appearance, but everything about her, bearing the flight physician's controlled urgency, had been replaced by a slower, more deliberate presence, the kind that people adopted when they were approaching a conversation they had been composing in their heads since before it became necessary. She stopped 3 feet away and leaned against the opposite wall, creating a geometry of distance that was respectful and intentional. She did not ask how he was feeling. She did not offer reassurance. She pulled out her phone and turned the screen toward him. On it was a page from a military medical database she still had access to through her former unit's archival system. The page displayed a photograph of a younger Marcus, cropped hair, dress uniform, the insignia of the Army Medical Corps on his collar beside a service record that listed deployments, commendations, and a specialty designation that read Trauma Surgery Forward Surgical Team 274th. She scrolled. The record showed 3 Army Commendation Medals, a deployment summary that included 4 combat rotations, a citation for a mass casualty event in which Major Marcus Cole had personally performed 11 emergency surgical procedures in 14 hours during a coordinated attack on a forward operating base, saving 9 of the 11 patients with equipment that a stateside hospital would have considered insufficient for a single operation. And then the record ended. An administrative note dated 7 years ago, voluntary separation, medical license status inactive, no forwarding contact, no subsequent employment in any medical capacity. She turned the phone back toward herself. The 274th Forward Surgical Team. I knew the unit designation from your tattoo. I served with the 345th Medical Company in a different theater, but we received briefings on your unit's protocols because your commanding surgeon had developed field techniques that were being adopted across the entire medical corps. She paused and her voice dropped to a frequency that carried weight without volume. That commanding surgeon was you. Marcus did not confirm. He did not deny. He stood against the wall with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the far end of the corridor. And his silence was not evasion, but exhaustion, the particular fatigue of a man whose defenses had been breached from a direction he had not anticipated. Nadia continued. The record says you disappeared after a personal loss, left the field completely. No one in the military medical community knew where you went. There were people who looked. Your techniques are still taught in combat medicine courses at Fort Sam Houston. Residents study your case logs, and the man who wrote those logs has been cleaning floors in a hospital in Colorado for 7 years. Marcus's jaw tightened. He did not want this. He did not want recognition, understanding, or the particular pain of being seen by someone who possessed the context to see him accurately. He wanted to pick up his cardboard box and walk 4 miles in the rain and heat leftover pasta and tell Owen that the schedule was changing and the building was different and everything was fine. But there was something else on her phone that she had not yet shown him, and she showed it now. A secondary record pulled from St. Elden's administrative archive through a query she had run while the trauma team was stabilizing Lily. The record was a death certificate with an accompanying investigation file, and the file bore a red banner across the top that read, sealed by administrative review. The name on the certificate was Dr. Sarah Cole. Marcus's breathing stopped. The corridor, the fluorescent lights, the distant beeping of monitors, all of it receded behind a wall of white noise that originated somewhere in his chest and expanded outward until the world felt like it was being observed from behind glass. You were married to her. Nadia's voice came through the glass, careful, deliberate. She died here, in this hospital, 7 years ago. Marcus did not speak. His hand found the wall behind him and pressed against it, fingers splayed as though he needed to confirm that the physical world was still solid. Nadia watched him and recognized the particular stillness of a person absorbing information that reorganized everything. She had worn that stillness herself in a conference room in Virginia when her commanding officer had informed her that her ex-husband had published their joint research under his name alone and that the fellowship committee had awarded the position to him based on work that was half hers. She knew what it felt like to have the architecture of your understanding shift beneath you. The file is sealed, she continued. An internal administrative review closed it. I can see the date and the authorization signature, but the contents are locked. Someone in this hospital's leadership decided that the circumstances of your wife's death should not be accessible. Marcus peeled himself from the wall. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet and contained in a way that suggested the containment was costing him more than the words themselves. I know she died of an amniotic fluid embolism. I was told the complication was unforeseeable and unpreventable. I accepted that because the alternative was spending the rest of my life inside a question I couldn't answer. And now I'm standing in the building where she died wearing the uniform they gave me to clean up after the patients they couldn't save, and you're showing me a sealed file that suggests there's something about her death that someone wanted hidden. Nadia held his gaze. I'm not showing you this to cause pain. I'm showing you because whatever happened to your wife may be connected to what almost happened to the governor's daughter tonight. The implication landed like a stone in still water, and the ripples spread in every direction. Marcus stared at her and felt the connection assemble itself from pieces he had never thought to place together: Sarah's death, the sealed file, the administrative review, and now tonight a 9-year-old girl who nearly died because St. Elden's trauma department did not have a qualified surgeon on duty during the night shift. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out with the mechanical reflex of a parent whose child's safety was the default priority of every waking moment. Owen's name glowed on the screen. 10:31 p.m. The boy should have been asleep an hour ago, Marcus answered. Owen's voice came through with the particular tension of a 13-year-old who had been lied to and knew it. Dad, I heard sirens going past the house. A lot of them. And then helicopters. I looked it up online and there's a story about a car accident on I-70 and a girl who got hurt and some guy who saved her and Dad. There's a video from someone's dash cam and I can see a person walking toward the stretcher. And the way he walks, Dad, that's you. I know the way you walk. Where are you? Marcus closed his eyes. The dashboard camera footage had already surfaced. The digital world moved faster than ambulances, faster than helicopters, faster than a man's ability to control the narrative of his own life. He pressed the phone against his ear and felt the familiar ache of a father trying to construct a shelter out of words that were no longer sufficient. I'm at the hospital, buddy. Something happened on my way home and I had to help someone. I'm safe. I need you to stay at the house and I'll explain everything when I get back. Owen's silence lasted 4 seconds. When his voice returned, it carried a quality that Marcus had not heard before. Not fear, not anger, but the quiet, steady awareness of a child who had spent 13 years studying his father's evasions and had finally decided to stop accepting them. The video shows the person opening the girl's throat with a knife, like a surgery. You're a janitor, Dad. Janitors don't do that. Marcus gripped the phone. The corridor stretched around him in both directions, fluorescent and infinite, and Nadia stood motionless against the opposite wall, not listening by choice but unable to leave without making the departure conspicuous. And somewhere above them, Lily Drake breathed through a tube he had placed, and the governor paced, and the hospital's administration was waking up to the reality that tonight's events were going to require more than a press release. I will explain everything. Not on the phone, when I get home. Owen's reply came fast and final. I'm coming there. The call ended. Marcus stared at the phone in his hand. His son had inherited Sarah's directness, the refusal to accept incomplete information when the complete version was available, and the willingness to pursue it with a stubbornness that made resistance futile. Owen would come. Marcus could call back and forbid it, and Owen would come anyway because 13-year-old boys who have been raised by fathers who taught them to think critically do not stop thinking critically when the subject becomes their father. Nadia spoke from across the corridor. He saw the video. Marcus pocketed the phone. He's on his way here. She nodded. The complications of that, a minor traveling alone at night to a hospital in the middle of a media event, registered in her expression, but she did not voice them. Instead, she offered something practical. I'll have someone watch for him at the main entrance. She pulled out her radio and spoke into it with the brief coded language of hospital staff coordinating logistics. Marcus rubbed the bridge of his nose. The night was layering itself on top of him. The firing, the roadside surgery, the second intervention, the sealed file, Owen, each event adding weight to a structure that had been built to hold exactly one burden at a time. He looked at Nadia, and for the first time since the roadside, he spoke to her not as a clinician or a fellow veteran, but as a person addressing another person who had shown him something he had not asked to see. Why did you search for me? Nadia considered the question. Her answer came without deflection. Because I've been where you are. Not the same loss, but the same disappearance. I spent 2 years after my divorce pretending I was fine with being a flight doctor in the mountains, when what I actually was someone hiding from a career that had been stolen from me. She shifted her weight against the wall. I recognize the hiding. Yours is just louder than mine was. The elevator at the end of the corridor chimed. The doors opened, and Carol Whitfield stepped out. She was 62, composed in the particular way that hospital administrators are composed during crises. The hair still in place, the blazer unwrinkled, the expression calibrated to project control while concealing the calculations running behind it. She was the chief executive officer of St. Elden Medical Center and had held the position for 11 years, which meant she had held it when Sarah Cole died, and she held it now as Lily Drake breathed through a tube placed by a man she had employed through a cleaning contract and never known existed. Whitfield's gaze swept the corridor. She registered Marcus's custodial uniform, Nadia's scrubs, and the particular energy between them that suggested a conversation she had interrupted. Her attention locked on Marcus. "I'm told you're the individual who performed the field intervention." Marcus met her eyes. The last time he had been in the administrative corridor of this building, he had been carrying a mop. The power differential had been absolute and invisible, the kind that exists between people who run institutions and people who clean them. That differential had shifted tonight, and Whitfield could feel the shift the way a captain feels a change in the current. Behind Whitfield, a young resident appeared slightly breathless. "Governor Kessler is requesting all parties involved in tonight's events to convene in the executive boardroom. The administration has drafted a preliminary statement for the press." Whitfield's composure tightened. She had not authorized the governor to convene anything in her building, and the territorial instinct of an executive whose authority was being bypassed showed in the subtle flattening of her mouth. She turned and walked toward the administrative wing without inviting Marcus to follow. He followed anyway. So did Nadia. The executive boardroom occupied the corner of the fourth floor, a room designed for the kind of conversations that shape budgets and careers, and occasionally the official versions of events that the public would be permitted to know. The table was long and dark polished and surrounded by chairs that cost more than Marcus earned in a week. Around it sat the hospital's legal counsel, the director of public relations, two department heads who had been pulled from home, and Whitfield, who took the head of the table with the practiced authority of someone who had sat in that chair for over a decade and intended to remain in it. Governor Drake entered from the opposite door. His agents positioned themselves at the wall. The governor's suit had been partially dried by hospital staff, but the damage remained: torn fabric, missing tie, the disheveled appearance of a man who had survived the same accident that nearly killed his daughter. He sat heavily and looked at no one in particular. Whitfield opened the proceedings. "Governor Kessler, we have prepared an initial statement for the media acknowledging your daughter's condition and the hospital's response. Given the sensitivity of the situation, we believe a measured, unified message." The governor raised his hand. The gesture was small, but it silenced the room, the way a judge's gavel silences a courtroom. His voice came with the controlled precision of a man who had spent 30 years in public life and knew exactly how to use authority when the occasion demanded it. "Your on-call trauma surgeon never arrived." Whitfield's composure cracked at the seam. She recovered instantly, but the fracture had been visible. There were extraordinary circumstances. A multi-car accident on the downtown, and a man you employed as a janitor, the governor continued, performed 2 life-saving surgical interventions on my daughter because your trauma department had no qualified surgeon available to do it. The room shifted. Eyes moved to Marcus, who stood near the door in his soaked gray uniform, the cardboard box still under his arm, the frozen watch on his wrist catching the overhead light. The PR director leaned forward, fingers laced. "Sir, for the media briefing, we need clarity on the intervener's status. Was the procedure authorized? Should he be identified as a current clinician? The liability implications." Marcus stepped forward. His voice carried the same calm that had commanded trauma bays in combat zones and controlled the chaos on a rain-drenched roadside, but here it was quieter, more measured, honed to cut through institutional language with the precision of someone who had no interest in politics and no patience for euphemism. "List what happened exactly as it happened. A child was dying. Your team could not reach her in time. I intervened because seconds don't wait for paperwork." Whitfield bristled. "The intervention, however well-intentioned, places this institution in a complicated legal position regarding unauthorized medical practice." The governor's hand hit the table. The sound was flat and final. "Legally, he did your job." The words fell into the room like a verdict, and the silence that followed them was the silence of people recalculating their positions. Marcus had not intended to speak again. He had intended to stand near the door and ensure the statement reflected reality and then leave before the situation deepened into something he could not extract himself from. But Whitfield's face triggered a recognition that bypassed intention and accessed something older, a memory buried beneath 7 years of mop handles and floor wax and the deliberate suppression of every detail associated with the worst night of his life. He knew that face. He had seen it once before 7 years ago through the small window of a conference room on this same floor, while he sat in a plastic chair in the hallway waiting for someone to explain why his wife was dead. Whitfield had been inside that conference room, speaking with two men in suits whose briefcases carried the logo of the hospital's legal firm. She had been the one who closed the door when she noticed Marcus watching through the glass. She had been the one who 3 days later signed the letter informing him that the hospital's internal review had concluded and that the file would be sealed pursuant to administrative policy. The memory collided with the present and produced a clarity that was blinding in its simplicity. The same woman who had sealed Sarah's death file was now sitting in the same chair, in the same room, managing the same kind of crisis, deploying the same institutional machinery to control the same kind of narrative. And the pattern beneath both events, the thing that connected a young doctor dying on a delivery table 7 years ago and a 9-year-old girl nearly dying on a roadside tonight, was not coincidence. It was policy. It was the systematic decision to operate a level 1 trauma center with insufficient specialist coverage during night shifts because the budget line for overnight staffing was the easiest line to cut, and the consequences of cutting it were statistical rather than personal, distributed across a population of patients who were unlikely to be governor's daughters and therefore unlikely to generate the kind of attention that made budget cuts visible. Marcus looked at Whitfield. His voice did not rise. It did not waver. It carried the terrible calm of a man stating facts that had taken 7 years to assemble and 3 seconds to deliver. 7 years ago, you cut the overnight obstetric specialist rotation from 2 physicians to 1. My wife presented with amniotic fluid embolism during a night shift when only 1 OB was on duty. A second physician could have managed the coagulopathy while the first maintained the airway. There was no second physician because you eliminated the position. She died. You sealed the investigation file to prevent litigation. The room went silent in a way that silence rarely achieves, not the absence of sound, but the presence of a weight so heavy that sound could not survive beneath it. Whitfield's face lost 2 shades of color. The legal counsel's pen stopped moving mid-word. The PR director's mouth opened and closed without producing language. Marcus continued each sentence, a surgical incision through institutional armor. Tonight, your trauma department had no qualified surgeon on overnight call. A 9-year-old girl nearly died on a roadside because the nearest surgical capability was stuck in traffic and the backup was 35 minutes away. The same budget logic, the same staffing gap, the same institutional decision to accept the risk because the risk was cheaper than the coverage. He paused. His eyes held Whitfield's with the unflinching steadiness of a man who had spent 7 years mopping her floors, while the truth about his wife's death sat locked in a file cabinet 3 stories above his mop closet. You sealed the record the first time. What are you going to do this time? The governor turned to Whitfield with an expression that combined political instinct with paternal fury in proportions that made the room feel several degrees colder. Is this true? The question was quiet. The quietness made it more dangerous. Whitfield's mouth worked. She produced the beginning of a response, a practiced deflection about policy reviews and institutional processes, but the governor was not listening. He was looking at Marcus, and his understanding of the man in front of him had undergone a complete structural revision. This was not a janitor who happened to know medicine. This was a surgeon of extraordinary capability who had buried himself in the bowels of the building where his wife had died, performing penance for a loss that may not have been inevitable, cleaning the floors of an institution that had failed the person he loved most and then covered its tracks. Nadia stepped forward. Her voice carried the measured authority of someone providing testimony rather than opinion. I will document every clinical detail of tonight's events. The field intervention, the misdiagnosis in the trauma bay, the staffing gap, and the connection to the sealed file. I'll testify if required. The governor stood, his chair pushed back with a screech against the hardwood. Revise the statement, accurate, complete. No omissions, or I address the press myself and I bring the sealed file with me. Whitfield nodded. The motion was stiff mechanical. The response of a person who understood that the ground beneath her had shifted and that resistance would accelerate rather than prevent the collapse. Marcus turned and walked out of the boardroom. The corridor outside was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant, indifferent note. He leaned against the wall and pressed his palms against his thighs to stop the shaking that had started in his hands and was migrating through his arms toward his chest. The delayed tremor of a man who had just detonated a truth he had carried for 7 years and did not yet know what the blast radius would be. Nadia appeared beside him. She did not touch him. She did not speak. She stood close enough that he could feel the warmth of another person's presence without the intrusion of contact and the restraint of that, the understanding that proximity without demand was sometimes the only form of support a person could accept, told Marcus more about who she was than anything she had said or shown him. The elevator at the far end of the corridor opened, and Owen Cole stepped out. He was 13 years old and small for his age, and wearing a hoodie that was too big for him, and sneakers that were untied, and he had the wide, searching eyes of a boy who had gotten into an Uber alone at 10:30 at night and ridden to a hospital because his father's voice on the phone had contained a frequency that Owen had never heard before, and that frightened him more than traveling through Denver in the dark. He saw Marcus from 30 feet away and stopped walking. Father and son regarded each other across the corridor's length, and in the space between them lay every lie Marcus had told to protect this boy, and every truth he had withheld for the same reason. And the weight of that accumulated silence was visible in the way Marcus's face changed when he saw his son, not the controlled mask of the surgeon or the blankness of the janitor, but something raw and undefended and very close to breaking. Owen walked forward. His steps quickened until they were almost running, and then he was there, arms wrapped around his father's torso, face pressed against the soaked uniform that smelled like rain and antiseptic, and the particular combination of chemicals that Owen associated with his father coming home at 2 in the morning and checking on him before going to bed. Marcus held him. His arms closed around the boy's shoulders, and his hand found the back of Owen's head, and he held on with the grip of a man who understood that this small, warm, trusting weight against his chest was the reason he had walked away from everything else, the reason he had accepted 7 years of mop handles and termination letters and the daily proximity to the place where his wife had died. Not because he was weak, because this was stronger than everything else. Owen spoke into Marcus's chest, his voice muffled but clear. "I know who you are, Dad. I've always known." Marcus's arms tightened. His chin rested on the top of his son's head. The corridor stretched in both directions, empty and bright, and Nadia stood 6 feet away watching the only scene that mattered, and her eyes carried the specific shine of a person witnessing something that touched the wound they carried in the same place. She stepped back. 1 step, then 2, creating distance. Understanding that this moment belonged to a father and his son, and that her presence, however welcome it might eventually become, was not yet earned in the currency of this particular grief. Marcus lifted his head. He looked at Nadia over Owen's hair. Their eyes met. His held gratitude and exhaustion, and the raw edge of a man who had spent the night being stripped of every layer he had built around himself. Hers held something she did not name, because naming it would have been premature, but it lived in the same neighborhood as recognition and respect, in the quiet, careful beginning of trust between two people who had both survived the experience of losing everything and starting over. He spoke, and the words were meant for her, but delivered across the distance she had created, acknowledging the space and the reason for it. "Thank you, but I'm not the man you think I am." Nadia's reply came soft, steady, and weighted with a certainty that did not require evidence, because it was built on something deeper than evidence. She had seen his hands on a child's throat. She had seen his knowledge deployed under pressure that would have broken anyone who did not possess his specific combination of training and loss. She had watched him weep silently against a wall after saving a life, and she had watched him hold his son with the same hands, and the contradiction between the two, the surgeon and the janitor, the hero and the man who wanted only to disappear, was not a contradiction at all. It was the complete picture of someone who had survived something enormous and chosen the smallest possible life as a way of containing the damage, and she recognized it because she had made a version of the same choice. "You're exactly who I think you are. That's the problem." Marcus held her gaze for a moment that lasted longer than either of them intended. Then Owen shifted against him, and the moment broke, and Marcus tightened his arm around his son and turned toward the exit at the end of the corridor. He needed to get Owen home. He needed to get himself out of this building before the press conference and the reporters and the institutional machinery that was already beginning to grind turned his name into something public. He needed to return to the small house at the edge of town and close the door and sit at the kitchen table and figure out how to tell a 13-year-old boy that his father was not who he thought he was, except that Owen had just said he already knew, and that realization that his son had been carrying the weight of an unspoken truth alongside him was heavier than anything the night had produced. They walked toward the stairwell. Marcus pushed the door open and guided Owen through, and as the heavy door swung shut behind them, he looked back down the corridor one final time. Nadia stood where he had left her, arms at her sides, watching him go, with an expression that was not pleading and not passive but patient, the expression of a person who understood that some people need to leave before they can decide to come back and who was prepared to be standing in the same place when they did. The door closed. Marcus and Owen descended the stairs in silence, their footsteps echoing in the concrete shaft. Father and son moving through the building's spine toward the exit that would take them into the night. Away from the boardroom where a governor was demanding answers. Away from the sealed file that held the truth about Sarah's death. Away from the woman in the corridor who had seen through every wall Marcus had built and had not flinched. The rain met them at the ground floor door. It had not stopped. Marcus pulled Owen closer, shielding him with his body, and they stepped out into the parking lot where the ambulance that had brought him sat dark and empty. Beyond it, the glow of news vans gathered at the main entrance, their satellite dishes raised like antennae searching for a signal that Marcus was not yet willing to broadcast. They walked in the opposite direction, toward the service road, toward the 4 miles of darkness that separated this building from the small house where the pasta sat cold in the fridge, and the textbook with Sarah's handwriting waited in a cardboard box, and the morning would arrive with questions that could no longer be deferred. Owen looked up at his father as they walked. His face was wet with rain, and his eyes held the fierce, complicated love of a child who has just discovered that the person who packs his lunch and helps with his homework has been carrying a secret the size of a previous life. He did not ask questions, not yet. He simply walked beside his father in the rain, matching his stride, and the silence between them was not empty, but full, full of everything that had happened and everything that was about to happen, and the fragile, stubborn bond that held them together through all of it. Behind them, the hospital's lights burned against the storm. Inside, a governor was reshaping a narrative. A surgeon's sealed file was being pulled from archives. A woman stood in a corridor thinking about a man who had walked away from her twice in one night, and both times had left her more certain that he would eventually stop walking. Marcus and Owen disappeared into the dark heading west, 2 figures against the rain, and the night was not finished with either of them. They made it 3 blocks before Owen stopped walking. The rain had thinned to a persistent drizzle that coated everything in a gray sheen, and the streetlight above them buzzed with the intermittent flicker of a bulb approaching the end of its life. Owen planted his feet on the wet sidewalk and looked up at his father with the expression of a boy who had decided that the distance between the hospital and their house was enough runway for the conversation that could not wait until morning. "Why did you hide it from me?" Marcus kept his eyes on the road ahead. The question had the weight of something rehearsed during the Uber ride, turned over and polished until the edges were sharp enough to cut through evasion. He owed his son an answer. He had owed him an answer for 7 years, and the debt had compounded in the way that withheld truths always compound, silently, relentlessly, until the interest exceeded the principal. Because I was afraid. The admission cost him more than the 2 roadside surgeries combined. Because if you knew I used to be a surgeon, you'd want me to go back. You'd ask why I stopped. And the answer to that, the real answer, is that your mother died and I couldn't separate the man who lost her from the man who held a scalpel, and I chose to be your father instead of being a doctor who couldn't save the person who mattered most. Owen absorbed this. His face worked through emotions that 13-year-olds should not have to process at 11 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday night, grief for a mother he barely remembered, confusion about a father he thought he knew, and something else, something that lived beneath the surface of his composure and rose now with a steadiness that startled Marcus because it looked exactly like Sarah. Owen's chin lifted, his voice came out clear. "But you just saved a little girl. You didn't stop being a doctor, Dad. You just stopped admitting it." Marcus felt the words enter him the way a blade enters tissue clean, precise, arriving at the exact location where resistance was thinnest. His son was right. The boy was 13 years old and standing in the rain with untied sneakers, and he was right, and Marcus had no defense against the truth when it came from the only person whose opinion he could not rationalize away. He knelt on the wet pavement. The cold soaked through his uniform pants instantly, and the ache in his knees was real and grounding and welcome because it pulled him out of the abstract and into the physical, into the concrete reality of a father on his knees in front of his son on a street in Colorado at the end of the worst and most consequential night of his life. He put his hands on Owen's shoulders. Your mom wrote something in a book a long time ago. She said, don't ever stop saving people. I read those words every single day for 7 years, and I told myself they were just words, just ink, just the handwriting of someone who wasn't here anymore to mean them. But she meant them, and I think she meant them for tonight. Owen's lower lip trembled. The composure held, but the tremor was visible, the structural integrity of a boy's bravery revealing its limits. He leaned forward and wrapped his arms around his father's neck, and they stayed like that on the sidewalk, while the drizzle collected on their backs and a car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping across them and moving on, leaving them in the dark with the particular intimacy that only exists between two people who have no one else. Marcus's phone vibrated. He ignored it. It vibrated again. He reached into his pocket with one hand, keeping the other on Owen's back, and glanced at the screen. The caller ID showed a number he did not recognize, but the area code was the state capital's prefix. He let it ring through to voicemail. They walked the remaining distance home in a silence that had changed character, no longer the weighted quiet of concealment, but the lighter, fragile quiet of two people who had said the essential thing and were resting in the space that opened after honesty. The house appeared at the end of the block, a single-story rental with a porch light that Owen had left on its yellow glow, the only warm color on a street made monochrome by rain and exhaustion. Inside, Marcus set the cardboard box on the kitchen table. Owen went to the bathroom to dry off, and Marcus stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the familiar sounds of their small life, the refrigerator's hum, the drip from the gutter outside the window, the creak of the bathroom door. He opened the box and lifted out the medical textbook. Sarah's inscription caught the light. He ran his thumb across the letters, feeling the slight indentation of pen pressure on the page, the physical evidence that her hand had touched the surface, that she had been real and alive, and sitting somewhere their apartment in Fort Worth. He remembered now the desk by the window, where she studied when she wrote these words for him. He placed the book on the table and sat down. The kitchen chair was hard and familiar, and held him the way ordinary things hold people at the end of extraordinary days, without drama, without demand, with the simple mechanical reliability of an object performing its function. Owen emerged in dry clothes and sat across from him. Between them the book. Between them everything. The phone vibrated again. Same number. Marcus answered this time. Governor Drake's voice came through the speaker with the particular rawness of a man who had not slept and would not sleep and had accepted both of these facts as the cost of the night. Mr. Cole, I have something you need to see. I'm sending a car. 30 minutes. Marcus looked at Owen. Owen looked at the phone. Neither spoke. The car arrived at 12:47 a.m. on a black sedan with state plates and a driver who said nothing beyond confirming Marcus's name. Owen climbed in beside his father without being invited and without asking permission. And Marcus did not protest, because protesting would have required a rationale he no longer possessed. The boy had earned his seat at this table. Tonight had made that undeniable. St. Elden at 1:15 a.m. had a different quality than the building Marcus had left an hour earlier. The emergency entrance had been cordoned by additional security. News vans had multiplied along the perimeter road, their lights creating an artificial dawn against the building's facade. Reporters stood in clusters beneath umbrellas, their cameras trained on the entrance, waiting for a story to emerge from the glass doors, which have shaped to the rumors that had been circulating since the first dashcam footage appeared online. The driver took them through a service entrance on the building's east side, and a security officer escorted them to the fourth floor through a route that avoided every public corridor. Owen walked beside Marcus, taking in the hospital's interior, with the wide-eyed alertness of a boy entering a world that his father had kept sealed behind silence for his entire life. Governor Drake waited in a small conference room adjacent to the ICU wing. He had changed into a borrowed shirt and slacks, but the exhaustion was architectural, embedded in the hollows beneath his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands when he lifted a folder from the table. His two agents stood outside the closed door. Inside, only the governor, and beside him, Nadia Lawson, who sat at the table with a laptop open and a look of controlled intensity that suggested she had been working while Marcus was gone and had found what she was looking for. The governor looked at Owen. Marcus felt the protective instinct flare the automatic calculation of whether his son should be present for whatever was about to happen, but Owen had positioned himself in the chair beside his father with the deliberate placement of someone who had no intention of being asked to leave. And Marcus recognized in that gesture the same immovable quality that Sarah had possessed, the quality that made arguing with her not difficult but pointless. Drake set the folder on the table. He opened it, and inside were photocopied pages bearing the administrative seal of St. Elden Medical Center and the date stamp of 7 years ago. The folder's cover bore the red banner that Nadia had shown Marcus on her phone, sealed by administrative review. I had my chief of staff contact the state attorney general's office an hour ago. Given the circumstances, an active patient safety concern involving the same institution, the same staffing pattern, and a connection to a previously sealed investigation, the AG authorized emergency unsealing under the public safety exception. Marcus stared at the folder. 7 years of unanswered questions lived inside those pages. 7 years of accepting the explanation he had been given, unforeseeable, unpreventable, because challenging it would have required a fight he did not have the strength for, not then, not with a 6-year-old son who needed him more than the truth needed sunlight. He opened the file. The medical examiner's report confirmed the cause of death, amniotic fluid embolism, a catastrophic event in which amniotic fluid enters the maternal bloodstream and triggers a cascade of coagulopathy, respiratory failure, and cardiac arrest. The condition was rare. The condition was in many cases genuinely unpreventable, but the report contained a section that Marcus had never seen, a section that the sealed version had excised the timeline. Sarah's first symptoms, sudden hypoxia and hypotension, had manifested at 11:42 p.m. The on-duty obstetrician, Dr. Karen Whitmore, had initiated emergency protocols within 2 minutes, but the embolism had triggered disseminated intravascular coagulation, a bleeding disorder that required simultaneous management of the airway and the hemorrhage, and Dr. Whitmore could not do both. She had called for the second OB on the night rotation, and the call had gone to voicemail because there was no second OB. The position had been eliminated from the night shift 4 months earlier as part of a cost reduction initiative approved by the hospital's executive board and signed by the CEO, Carol Whitfield. Dr. Whitmore had then called for a general surgeon to assist. The general surgeon on call was performing an appendectomy on another floor and could not leave the table. The next available surgeon was 40 minutes out. Sarah's heart had stopped at 11:58 p.m. on 16 minutes after the first symptom. The resuscitation efforts had continued for 22 minutes before she was pronounced dead at 12:20 a.m. The internal review had concluded that a second physician present at the time of the embolism could have managed the coagulopathy while Dr. Whitmore maintained the airway, and that this dual provider approach was the standard of care for AFE management. The review had further concluded that the absence of the second provider was a direct result of the staffing reduction, and that the staffing reduction had been implemented without adequate risk assessment. The review had recommended reinstatement of the second OB position and a comprehensive audit of overnight staffing levels across all critical departments. Carol Whitfield had sealed the review, reinstated nothing, and continued the same staffing model for 7 years. The same model that tonight had left the trauma department while without a surgeon when Lily Drake's airway collapsed. Marcus read the pages twice. His hands did not shake during the reading. The tremor came after when he set the pages down and placed his palms flat on the table and stared at the surface between them with the fixed gaze of a man watching the foundation of a 7-year understanding crack apart and rearrange itself into a shape he had feared but never confirmed. Sarah's death had not been inevitable. It had been the consequence of a decision made in a boardroom by a woman who had calculated the financial cost of overnight staffing and concluded that the risk was acceptable. And when the risk materialized and a 35-year-old doctor with a newborn son bled to death 16 minutes after her first symptom, that same woman had sealed the evidence and continued the policy that had killed her. Owen sat beside him. The boy could not read the medical terminology, but he could read his father's face, and what he saw there made him reach across the table and place his hand on Marcus's forearm. The gesture was small and enormous and exactly sufficient. The governor spoke into the silence. I authorize the unsealing because what happened to your wife is connected to what happened to my daughter. The same policy, the same decision maker, the same failure. He paused. And because you deserve to know. Marcus did not lift his eyes from the table. The words that formed were quiet and controlled and carried the particular devastation of a man who was grieving not the loss itself, that grief was 7 years old and had calcified into something he wore like bone, but the discovery that the loss had been unnecessary, that it could have been prevented by the presence of one additional physician, a position that cost the hospital a salary, and benefits package that probably amounted to less than the conference table they were sitting around. He breathed. In, out. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Owen's hand stayed on his arm. Nadia sat across the table watching him with the stillness of a person who understood that this moment required witnessing, not intervention. Then the tears came. Not the dramatic collapse of a man performing grief for an audience, but the quiet structural failure of a dam that had held for 7 years and could not hold for one more second. They tracked down his face in 2 straight lines, and he did not wipe them, and he did not hide them, and he did not apologize for them. He sat in a conference room in the hospital where his wife had died, and he wept for the first time since the night he had held Owen in the recovery room and promised a 6-pound infant that he would never let the world take anything from them again. Owen's hand tightened on his forearm. The boy's own eyes glistened, but his grip was steady, the grip of a child holding his father together, reversing the roles that fatherhood had assigned them, and the strength required for a 13-year-old to perform that reversal was a kind of courage that had no name in any language Marcus knew. The governor looked away. He had his own grief to manage, the particular species of terror that comes from knowing your child survived by the width of a second hand's movement and watching another father's pain amplified his own in ways that political composure could not contain. Nadia rose from her chair. She moved to the door and stepped out into the corridor, pulling it shut behind her. Through the narrow window, she could see Marcus and Owen, and she positioned herself against the far wall and waited the way she had waited in the corridor earlier, present, but not intrusive, close enough to be reached, and far enough to be irrelevant until relevance was invited. Inside the room, the grief ran its course. Grief does this when it is finally permitted. It arrives, it occupies every available space, and then, having been acknowledged, it begins to recede, not disappear, never disappear, but recede to a depth where breathing becomes possible again. Marcus breathed. He placed his hand over Owen's. Father and son sat in the quiet aftermath of a truth that had taken 7 years to surface and 15 minutes to absorb. The governor straightened. His voice returned softer now, carrying the tonal quality of a man who had been changed by the last 4 hours and knew it. I'm going to make sure Whitfield faces a full investigation. The state health department will audit this hospital's staffing records going back a decade. Whatever they find, it will be public. Marcus nodded. The acknowledgement was minimal, but it was the first movement he had made since the tears, and it signified a return to the surface, a re-engagement with the world outside the sealed file and the grief it contained. He stood. Owen stood with him. The governor extended his hand and Marcus took it, and the handshake was not political and not transactional, but the simple weighted contact of 2 fathers who had each in different ways been failed by the same institution and saved by the same improbable night. Marcus led Owen into the corridor. Nadia was there leaning against the wall with her arms folded, and when Marcus emerged, she searched his face the way a physician searches a patient, looking for signs of distress, assessing capacity, determining what kind of care was appropriate. What she found was a man who had been broken open and was in the process of reassembling, and the reassembly was happening in real time, visible in the way his posture straightened and his jaw set, and his eyes, still red, regained the focused clarity of a person who had survived something and was now calculating what to do with the survival. She did not speak first. She waited. Marcus stopped in front of her. Owen stood at his hip, watchful and quiet. The corridor was empty except for the three of them and the low hum of the hospital's nighttime metabolism monitors beeping in distant rooms, ventilation systems circulating the same conditioned air, the building breathing around them, the way buildings do when they hold sleeping patients and working staff, and the accumulated weight of every life that has passed through their doors. Sarah was a doctor, too. Marcus's voice came from a place he had not accessed in conversation for 7 years, the place where he kept the version of himself that had been married and whole and capable of trust. She would hate me for quitting. Nadia's eyes held his. Or she'd understand exactly why you had to. The sentence landed without force. It arrived the way certain truths arrive, not as arguments, but as recognitions, not demanding agreement, but offering a possibility that the listener had not permitted themselves to consider. The possibility that Sarah, who had known him better than anyone, who had watched him operate in conditions that broke other surgeons who had loved him, not despite his intensity, but because of it, might have looked at the 7 years he had spent raising their son alone and cleaning floors and surviving, and might have understood that the sacrifice was not weakness, but the only form of strength he had left. Marcus did not confirm whether the possibility was true. He could not know. Sarah was dead, and the dead do not validate or refute the interpretations of the living. But something in Nadia's framing released a pressure he had carried since the night he walked out of St. Elden with a newborn in his arms, a pressure that came from believing he had betrayed his wife's memory by abandoning the work she had loved, and the release of that pressure changed the shape of his breathing in a way that was subtle and permanent. They stood in the corridor, and neither moved to end the moment, and Owen looked between them with the perceptiveness of a boy who recognized the particular frequency of two adults communicating something larger than the words they were using. Then Marcus's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, a text from the governor's office press briefing in 20 minutes. Governor requests your presence. No identification required. He showed the screen to Nadia. She read it and looked at him with an expression that was not expectant, but opened the expression of a person offering a door without pressure to walk through it. The press briefing was being staged in St. Elden's main lobby, the only space large enough to hold the 50-plus reporters who had gathered outside. Marcus could hear them through the walls as he descended the stairwell, with Owen and Nadia, the low collective murmur of an audience waiting for a story punctuated by the click and whir of cameras being tested, and the occasional shouted question to hospital security that went unanswered. At the ground floor, a hospital aide met them and handed Marcus a clean surgical jacket, plain white unmarked. Nadia took it from the aide and held it open for Marcus, and the domesticity of the gesture, one person helping another into a coat, carried an intimacy that neither of them acknowledged, because acknowledging it would have required a conversation for which there was no time. Marcus slipped his arms into the sleeves. The fabric settled on his shoulders with a weight that was both foreign and familiar. The particular drape of clinical clothing that his body remembered the way a horse remembers a saddle, not with enthusiasm, but with the deep muscular recognition of something it was built to carry. Owen positioned himself against the wall near the stairwell door, out of sight of the lobby, but close enough to see his father through the glass partition. Marcus looked at him. Owen gave a nod, small, firm, the nod of a boy giving his father permission to be someone other than just his dad for the next 15 minutes. The lobby doors opened. The lights hit first camera flashes, video lights, the harsh white illumination that reporters use to eliminate shadows, and that has the secondary effect of eliminating the ability to hide. Governor Drake stood at a podium that hospital staff had assembled from conference room furniture, and the seal of the state of Colorado hung behind him on a banner that his advance team had somehow produced in the hour since the briefing was announced. Marcus entered from the side door with Nadia beside him. They positioned themselves behind and to the left of the governor, partially shielded by the podium's angle, visible to the room but not centered. The cameras swung, murmurs intensified. Reporters who had been waiting for the identity of the phantom doctor leaned forward in their chairs, and the collective focus of the room narrowed to the two figures flanking the governor, one in scrubs, one in a borrowed surgical jacket over a custodial uniform, both carrying the particular stillness of people who had been through something that the press would spend the next 72 hours trying to reconstruct. The governor raised his hand. The room quieted. Tonight, my daughter survived a medical emergency that should have been fatal. His voice was steady but thin, stretched over the framework of emotion that supported it. She was injured in a car accident on Interstate 70, her airway closed. There was no surgeon available. The hospital's on-call specialist was unable to reach us. The backup was 35 minutes away. My daughter had 30 seconds. He paused. The room held its breath. A man stepped forward. A man who was walking home after being fired from his job. A man who owed nothing to anyone at that scene. He saw a child in danger and he did not hesitate. He stabilized her airway on the roadside in the rain. He accompanied her to this hospital. When complications arose that the trauma team had not anticipated, he intervened a second time. He identified an injury that the team had missed. He guided the procedure that saved her life. The governor's voice gained a quality that transcended the political register he had been speaking in. It became the voice of a father, unfiltered and cracking at the edges. He is here tonight. He has chosen to remain anonymous, and I respect that choice. This briefing is not to expose him. It is to honor him and to tell the truth about what happened and to ensure that the institutional failures that made his intervention necessary are investigated and corrected. Reporters erupted. Questions overlapped. Who is he? Is he a doctor? Why was he fired? Where was the on-call surgeon? Is the governor calling for an investigation? And the noise swelled against the lobby's marble surfaces until it became a wall of sound that the governor absorbed without flinching. He is here, the governor repeated, lifting his hand for quiet. He will remain anonymous unless he decides otherwise. What I will tell you is that heroes do not always carry credentials. Sometimes they are walking home in the rain carrying everything they own in a cardboard box invisible to the system that just discarded them. And they still stop. They still act. Not because anyone asked them to, but because they cannot walk past a child who is dying. The lobby settled into a different kind of silence. Not the frustrated silence of reporters denied a lead, but a quieter recognition, the collective awareness that the story in front of them was larger than a name and more important than a headline. Marcus stood behind the governor and felt the weight of 100 cameras pointed in his direction. The surgical jacket concealed his custodial uniform. Nadia's position beside him provided partial cover. He was visible but indistinct, a silhouette rather than a portrait, and the anonymity held just barely like a dam, holding back a river that would eventually find its way through. Then something shifted inside him. The shift was not sudden. It had been building since the roadside, accumulating force through the trauma bay, in the boardroom, in the sealed file, and Owen's arms around his torso in the corridor. It was the accumulated weight of a night that had stripped away every layer of concealment he had spent 7 years constructing, and beneath those layers was a man who was tired of hiding. Not from the press, not from the hospital, but from himself. He stepped forward, one step enough to bring him alongside the governor. The cameras clicked faster. The murmurs rose. Nadia's hand twitched at her side, but she did not reach for him because she understood in the way that one soldier understands another that this was not retreat or advance, but a decision that belonged entirely to the person making it. Marcus looked at the room. He looked at the cameras and the microphones and the faces of 50 strangers who wanted his name and his story and the clean narrative arc of a hero emerging from obscurity, and he knew that what he was about to do would change everything for Owen, for himself, for the quiet life they had built out of grief and survival, and the stubborn refusal to let the world take anything else from them. His voice, when it came, carried through the lobby without amplification. It was the voice of a man who had commanded surgical teams in combat and directed emergency procedures on rain-soaked highways and held his wife's memory in a sealed file for 7 years, and it contained every ounce of that accumulated experience compressed into sentences that were chosen not for the press, but for the boy watching through the glass partition 20 feet away. My name is Marcus Cole. I was a trauma surgeon. I served in the Army Medical Corps. I left medicine 7 years ago when my wife, also a doctor, died in this hospital from complications that a sealed internal review later attributed to a staffing reduction that left her without adequate care. Tonight, a 9-year-old girl nearly died from the same institutional failure. The story that matters here is not mine. It's the question of why a level 1 trauma center operates without sufficient overnight surgical coverage, and how many patients have been harmed by that decision while the evidence was locked in a file cabinet. The lobby detonated. Questions came from every direction, overlapping into an incomprehensible wall, and the trajectory of the story shifted in real time from mysterious hero to systemic failure, from human interest to investigative target, from the kind of coverage that makes a man famous for a week to the kind that makes an institution accountable for a decade. The governor did not attempt to regain the podium. He stepped aside and let the moment belong to Marcus, because the truth Marcus had delivered was more powerful than any statement a politician could craft, and the governor was smart enough to recognize the difference. Marcus stepped back. He had said what needed saying. The cameras continued to flash, but he was already moving toward the side door, Nadia falling into step beside him, and the noise of the press conference faded behind them as they re-entered the corridor where Owen was waiting. The boy's face was luminous. Not with excitement, not with the reflected glow of his father's sudden notoriety, but with something deeper and more permanent. The expression of a child who had watched his father walk out of hiding and tell the truth and survive it, and who understood in the wordless way that children understand the things that matter most, that what he had just witnessed was not fame but freedom. Marcus reached him, and Owen did not speak. He just stepped forward and walked beside his father, and the three of them, Marcus, Owen, Nadia, moved through the hospital's quiet corridors toward the ICU wing, because there was one more thing that needed to happen before this night could end. Lily Drake's room was on the fourth floor, walled in glass, monitored by equipment that beeped in the steady rhythm of stable vital signs. She lay beneath a thin blanket, her color improved, her chest rising and falling with the mechanical regularity of a patient being supported by the tube that Marcus had placed and Brant had secured. Her father sat in a chair beside the bed, his hand wrapped around her fingers, and he looked up when Marcus appeared at the glass. The governor rose and opened the door. Marcus entered alone, leaving Owen and Nadia in the corridor. The room was warm and smelled of antiseptic and the faint vanilla of a pediatric lotion that a nurse had applied to the girl's dry skin. The monitors cast a green-blue light across the walls, and in that light, Lily looked very small and very alive, and very much like a child who had no idea how close the margin had been. Her eyes opened. Not fully, the sedation was still working, pulling her towards sleep, even as awareness pushed back, but enough. Her gaze drifted across the ceiling, then to her father, then to the unfamiliar man standing at the foot of her bed in a white surgical jacket that did not quite fit. Her brows knitted. Her lips moved beneath the oxygen support, forming shapes that resolved into a whisper that was barely audible above the monitor's rhythm. "I remember your voice. You told me I'd be okay." When I couldn't breathe. Marcus moved closer. He kept his movements slow, the way he had always moved around injured children in field hospitals. No sudden gestures, no looming presence, just the gradual approach of a person who meant no harm and carried no agenda beyond reassurance. "You're okay now. Your team is taking good care of you." She blinked. The sedation pulled at her, and her eyes fluttered with the effort of staying open against the pharmacological tide. But she held them open long enough to say one more thing, and the thing she said was simple and complete and required no elaboration. "Thank you," Marcus nodded. The two words entered him and found the place where the night's accumulated weight had settled: the grief, the revelation, the surgeries, the confrontation, the public declaration, and they did not lighten the weight, but they gave it meaning, the way a keystone gives meaning to an arch. Without the keystone, the stones are just weight. With it, they become structure. The governor stood behind his daughter's bed. His eyes were wet, and he did not disguise them. He looked at Marcus, and the look contained everything he had been trying to say since the roadside: gratitude. Shame, wonder, debt compressed into a single expression that language would have diminished. Marcus held the look for 3 seconds. Then he stepped back and out, and the glass door closed between them with a soft click that sounded to Marcus like the closing of a chapter. In the corridor, Owen was examining the military watch on Marcus's wrist. He had taken his father's hand while they waited, and his fingers had found the watch, and he was studying the frozen second hand with the focused attention of a boy solving a problem. "Dad, this doesn't work." Marcus looked down. The second hand, arrested at the 4:17 mark for 7 years, caught the quarter light. "It hasn't worked in a long time." Owen released his hand. "I saw a watch repair place on the first floor near the gift shop. They fix batteries. It's 1 in the morning, buddy. It's closed." Owen's expression suggested that the operational hours of a hospital gift shop, watch repair kiosk, were not, in his estimation, a significant obstacle. He looked at Nadia, who had been standing nearby with the particular patience of someone who had learned to occupy waiting without filling it. She reached into her pocket, produced a small multi-tool, the kind that flight physicians carried for equipment adjustments, and extended it toward Owen without a word. Owen took it. He sat down on the corridor bench, placed his father's wrist on his knee, and began working on the watch's case back with the concentration of a boy who understood perhaps better than anyone in the building what it would mean if the second hand moved again. Marcus watched his son's hands, small, careful, precise in the way that young hands are when they are treating something fragile. The case back came free. Owen studied the interior with a squint, then used the multi-tool's smallest blade to nudge the battery contact into a better seat. The second hand twitched, moved, swept forward one tick, then another, then found its rhythm and began circling the face with the steady, unhurried persistence of time resuming after a long interruption. Owen looked up. "Dad, it's running." Marcus stared at the watch. The second hand swept past the 4:17 mark, where it had been frozen the minute Sarah died. The minute time stopped meaning anything, and continued past it, ticking forward into 4:18 and 4:19 and 4:20 and beyond. And each tick was small and mechanical and entirely insignificant, except that it was not insignificant at all. It was time moving again. It was the clock inside Marcus Cole restarting. He looked at Owen. He looked at the watch. He said nothing because there was nothing to say that the moment was not already saying for itself. Nadia watched from 3 feet away. Her eyes carried the specific brightness of a person witnessing something that they would remember for the rest of their life without ever fully being able to explain why it mattered as much as it did. The next hour passed in the particular way that hours pass at the end of crises, in administrative fragments, in quiet logistics, in the slow unwinding of tension that had been coiled since 9:05 p.m. The governor's staff processed the press briefing's fallout. Hospital security managed the reporters. The ICU team confirmed Lily's continued stability. Dr. Brandt found Marcus near the stairwell and spoke quietly. "What you did in my trauma bay." The diagnosis, the intervention, it was the difference between a catastrophic outcome and a recovery. "I was seconds from an error that would have killed her, thank you." Marcus accepted the words with a nod that was neither dismissive nor inviting the acknowledgement of a professional receiving professional respect from someone who had earned the right to give it. Carol Whitfield did not appear. Her absence was conspicuous in the way that institutional absences are not the absence of a person, but the absence of a position, the sudden vacuum where authority used to stand. Word traveled through the hospital's informal networks, nurse to nurse, resident to resident, the way information always travels in buildings where people work long hours in close proximity. The CEO was in her office with legal counsel, and the state attorney general's office had requested St. Elden's staffing records for the past 10 years. Ray Taggart's name surfaced briefly in the night's aftermath, carried by a text message from a Pinnacle Cleaning Services supervisor to an administrative contact at St. Elden, asking whether the employee terminated earlier that evening was the same individual being discussed on the news. The message went unanswered, but its existence confirmed that the ripple was spreading, and by morning the story of a janitor fired for a faulty junction box and then revealed as a combat surgeon who saved the governor's daughter would become the kind of narrative that press offices cannot contain and public relations strategies cannot shape. Marcus did not concern himself with any of this. He sat in a plastic chair on the ICU floor with Owen asleep against his shoulder and watched the monitors through the glass wall of Lily Drake's room, tracking the numbers not because he doubted the team, but because his nervous system would not allow him to stop tracking them until the girl was beyond the window where relapse was possible. At 2:45 a.m., Nadia appeared with 2 cups of coffee from the staff lounge. She handed one to Marcus, careful not to wake Owen, and sat in the adjacent chair. They drank in silence. The coffee was bitter and slightly burned the universal flavor of hospital coffee at 3 in the morning, and the familiarity of it, the shared experience of bad coffee during long nights in medical settings, created a connection that was more intimate than conversation. When her cup was empty, Nadia reached into her jacket pocket and produced a business card. It was plain white with black text. Dr. Nadia Lawson, Director, Colorado Rural Emergency Medical Training Initiative. Below the title was a phone number and an address in a small town west of Denver. She placed it on the armrest between them. Marcus looked at it. "I'm not asking you to go back to the operating room." Her voice was low enough to pass beneath Owen's sleep. "I'm building something in the mountains, training paramedics and rural physicians to handle the kind of emergencies that never make it to a hospital in time. Field techniques, improvised protocols, the things you wrote the manual on. Marcus turned the card between his fingers. It's my project, my funding, my team. I'm not offering you a job. I'm inviting you into something I built because the world needs what you know, and because I spent 4 years building it alone, and I'm tired of alone. The last four words carried a weight that exceeded their clinical context. Marcus heard them. He understood what she was offering and what she was not offering. She was not asking him to be a surgeon again. She was not asking him to be a hero. She was asking him to take the knowledge that had saved Lily Drake and transmit it to people who operated in the spaces between hospitals, the roads and mountainsides and rural clinics where the distance between life and death was measured in the same minutes in millimeters that his career had been built to navigate. He held the card. He did not put it down. He did not give it back. Nadia stood. She looked at him and at Owen and at the watch on his wrist with its newly restored second hand, and her expression carried the patience of a woman who had extended an invitation and was prepared to wait for an answer that might take days or weeks or months to arrive. She walked away down the corridor. Her footsteps faded. The ICU hummed. Owen breathed against Marcus's shoulder. The business card stayed in his hand. At 4:30 a.m., Marcus gently shifted Owen awake. The boy blinked, disoriented, then registered the hospital corridor in his father's face, and the night came back in a rush that showed in his eyes. They gathered themselves, descended the stairs, and exited through the same service door they had entered. The rain had stopped. The air smelled like wet earth and pine, and the particular freshness that follows a storm that has spent itself. The state car was gone. Marcus had not expected it to wait. He and Owen stood in the parking lot and looked east, where the first gray light of dawn was separating the mountains from the sky, and then they turned west and began walking. The same road, the same 4 miles between St. Elden and the small rented house at the edge of town. Marcus had walked this road 12 hours earlier carrying a cardboard box in the belief that his life was defined by what he had lost. He walked it now carrying the same box lighter by one medical textbook that he had left on the kitchen table, and the belief that had sustained 7 years of hiding had been replaced by something he could not yet name, but could feel in the changed rhythm of his steps, in the changed quality of the air, Gimbar entering his lungs. Owen walked beside him, stride-matched shoulder nearly reaching his father's, growing in the way that boys grow, not evenly, not predictably, but in sudden surges that catch their parents off guard and make them realize that the child they are protecting has been for some time now protecting them back. They reached mile marker 214 at 5:15 a.m., the stretch of road where the helicopters had landed. The asphalt was scarred with dark stains, hydraulic fluid from the landing gear, the chemical residue of road flares, the faint black marks of rotor wash on pavement. Yellow tape fluttered from a traffic cone that no one had collected. The guardrail where the Suburban had rested was dented and scraped, and beyond it the scrublands showed the flattened paths where emergency vehicles had driven onto the shoulder. Marcus stopped. Owen stopped beside him. They stood on the exact spot where 7 hours earlier Marcus had set down a cardboard box and walked toward a dying child. Owen reached into the box and pulled out the medical textbook. He opened it to the first page where Sarah's handwriting caught the dawn light, the blue ink vivid against the yellowed paper. He read the inscription aloud, and his voice carried in the still morning air with a clarity that the night would not have permitted. For the man I love most, never stop saving people. He looked at his father. Mom wrote this for you, right? Marcus nodded. She was right, Dad. Marcus looked at his son. He looked at the inscription. He looked at the road beneath his feet, marked with the evidence of a night that had dragged him back into the life he had fled and shown him that the thing he had been running from was not the scalpel or the operating room or the weight of responsibility. It was the fear that he would fail again, that he would hold someone's life in his hands and watch it slip through, and that the grief of that failure would be the final thing that broke him. But he had not failed. Not tonight. He had held a child's life in his hands, and his hands had not shaken, and the child was alive, and his son was standing beside him, and the watch on his wrist was ticking again, and the sun was coming up over the mountains in a long, slow burn of orange and gold that turned the wet road into something that looked for a moment like it was made of light. His phone rang. He pulled it from his pocket. The screen showed a name he had added to his contacts 3 hours ago, Nadia Lawson. He looked at Owen. Owen looked at the phone, then the boy's gaze moved to the business card still visible in Marcus's jacket pocket, and then to the textbook in his own hands, and then back to his father's face. His expression carried no pressure and no expectation. It carried trust. Marcus answered the call. Nadia's voice came through and the connection was clear, despite the mountain air, and her words were measured in the way that offers are measured when the person making them understands that the answer matters more than the question. There's a situation in the high country, landslide near Silverton, multiple casualties trapped. Search and rescue is mobilizing, but the nearest trauma capability is 90 minutes out. I'm assembling a field team. Marcus, I'm not ordering you, I'm asking. He looked at the road, the flare marks, the hydraulic stains, the place where everything had changed. He looked at Owen. The boy held the textbook against his chest. Sarah's words pressed against his heart, and he was smiling. Not the bright, unguarded smile of a child, the steady, knowing smile of a young man who understood that his father was standing at the intersection of who he had been and who he was becoming, and who wanted him to step forward. Marcus lifted his eyes to the mountains. The sun cleared the ridge line and flooded the valley with gold, and the wet road gleamed, and the air tasted like pine and possibility, and the particular sweetness of a morning that follows a night that has taken everything and given something back. He looked at his son one more time. Owen nodded. The nod was small, firm, absolute. Marcus stepped forward on the road, Owen beside him, heading west into the light. And the phone was at his ear, and the watch was ticking, and the morning was new, and the man who had been walking home alone in the dark was no longer walking home and no longer alone. The road stretched ahead and they followed it.